Brothers and sisters, open your eyes. The US government is on the verge of economic suicide. When you hear their crazy new plan to contain China, you will literally ask the same thing these American financial economists are asking. Is the Biden administration really trying to destroy the dollar? It all started 2 years ago when Russia launched its latest military operation against Ukraine. The US and its European allies responded to Putin's invasion by freezing more than $300 billion of Russian centralized assets. Their goal was simple: to cause panic in Russian markets and hopefully destroy the Russian economy. By denying Russia access to the SWFT system, the US hoped to intimidate Russian citizens, provoke a banking panic, and ideally even bring about the overthrow of Vladimir Putin. On paper, the plan looked very likely, and when the Russian ruble actually collapsed after the invasion, it looked like the US strategy would work. But then, surprisingly, the whole plan completely fails. So far, more than 16,000 sanctions have been imposed against Russia. But amazingly, Russia has managed to avoid every single one of them by switching to a war economy, hoarding gold and using it to trade commodities around the world. But here's where things get very interesting. Instead of paralyzing Russian banks, it was American banks that began to collapse last spring when Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and Silvergate Bank collapsed. Many regional banks across the United States faced a similar fate until the Federal Reserve stepped in and issued emergency loans to stop the panic among worried American citizens. But now Janet Yellen, along with the European Commission, wants to take the $300 billion seized from Russia and give it directly to Ukraine. This, of course, would violate international law. But more importantly, it will send a clear message to the rest of the world. Western financial markets are no longer a safe place to keep your money. In fact, this single move could completely undermine global confidence in the US dollar and euro, as the safety of your assets will depend on your standing in both Washington and Brussels. Don't be fooled. We will see everyone from businessmen, companies, and even countries that hold a large share of U.S. debt start to move away from holding U.S. dollars as the geopolitical risks are simply too high. China was once the largest holder of U.S. debt, but in recent years it has been getting rid of dollars as quickly as possible and hoarding gold. In fact, it's not just China's central banks that are doing this. In 2022, central banks around the world have been buying as much gold as possible, and that's one of the main reasons why gold continues to break records almost every month and shows no signs of slowing down. But wait, I haven't even told you about Biden's latest brilliant idea to attack China with a currency war. And believe me, it's honestly one of the craziest ideas I'd ever heard. Some might argue that staying on good terms with the US and EU should be relatively easy. Only countries like North Korea, Iran, and Russia that oppose the US position have problems. But this is not entirely true. A few months ago, African Business published an article that shows that the US is now threatening Uganda with sanctions because of a new anti-gay law. So it's not just about countries waging war and opposing the US. Now, if you're a country that doesn't share the ideology of the US government, you may wake up to find that your access to the US dollar has disappeared overnight. And it doesn't end there. Want to see how crazy it can get? Donald Trump, the favorite in the 2024 presidential race, now plans to impose sanctions on countries that refuse to use the US dollar. Trump said in a recent interview with CNBC, "I hate it when countries refuse to use the dollar. I would not allow countries to abandon the dollar because when we lose that standard, it would be like losing the Revolutionary War." But regardless of what a former or current president says, the world is changing. A few months ago, the president of Indonesia gave a speech saying that his country needed to diversify its dollar and dollar-denominated assets, saying, "Look what happened to Russia." That's why Indonesia, which incidentally is the fourth most populous country in the world, launched a special de-dollarization task force last year to promote the use of the local currency in bilateral transactions and to diversify risk from the US dollar. Not surprisingly, many countries in the global South and Latin America, Africa, and Asia are moving away from the United States and closer to China. In fact, we should probably rename the global South the global majority because 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And it's no secret that many countries in this global majority want to see less sanctions and less use of the US dollar. But here's where things get really interesting again. And as promised, I'm going to share with you the US government's latest threats against China and how it relates to the future of global currencies. Last week, Business Insider reported that the U.S. is considering using the power of the dollar to stop Chinese banks helping Russia, but their plan could have dire consequences. So, what's really going on? U.S. policymakers are probably looking at this chart from 2020, which shows the total trade value between Russia and China at $107 billion. And now they see data for 2023 that shows the total trade value between these two strategic partners is already $240 billion, an increase of 124% in 3 years. The U.S. government is unhappy that China is increasing trade with Russia. But in fact, more than 85% of the world does not impose sanctions against Russia. In fact, one of America's biggest allies, India, has been one of the largest importers of Russian oil since the latest conflict in Ukraine began. Of course, this simple fact doesn't matter to American politicians. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. is developing sanctions that threaten to disconnect some Chinese banks from the global financial system. And frankly, this is where the U.S. government leadership has completely lost touch with reality. Remember the saying, don't play with fire unless you want to get burned. This is exactly the path the U.S. government now wants to lead us down. First, hadn't we learned anything from the failed attempt to contain Russia with over 16,000 sanctions? Apparently not. The sanctions have only strengthened Russian military power. And despite any emergency aid package that Congress passes to send more money to Ukraine, there is no chance that this conflict will end in anything other than a Russian victory. And this is not my opinion or a repeat of Russian propaganda. This is what almost all seasoned U.S. military experts are now stating. But now it's time to get extremely realistic. Because imposing sanctions on Russia is one thing, but if the U.S. does sanction Chinese banks and disconnect them from the international monetary system, they literally cannot find a better way to encourage the entire world to abandon the U.S. dollar faster. And let me explain this with one simple chart. In 2000, the United States had tremendous leverage over the entire world because it was the #1 trading partner for every country in the world. The United States was the top trading partner for every continent and major country in the world. But 2 decades later, only a handful of countries consider the U.S. their #1 trading partner. The vast majority of the world is covered in red, which clearly shows that position of leverage is now held by China. And with this leverage, China can take one simple step and accelerate de-dollarization around the world. More than 120 countries now consider China their top trading partner. Of course, the Chinese government knows this and can simply announce that from now on, to buy Chinese goods, they must be bought exclusively in Chinese currency. Soon, most of the world would move to de-dollarization because China is a major trading partner for most countries. That's why the idea of imposing sanctions on Chinese banks is absolutely insane and would only lead to a complete failure of the government and the US dollar. In fact, the de-dollarization trend is an event that started decades ago around the turn of the century. In 1999, we were still living in a unipolar world where the United States was the only superpower on the planet. In 1999, 73% of the world's foreign exchange reserves were in US dollars. Over the next 2 decades, China began to rise. Keep in mind the chart I showed earlier that documents the shift in just 20 years from the United States to China and how China now dominates global supply. When China became the world's leading trading partner, it was the beginning of a new multipolar world where countries now had the choice of working with the US, working with China, or working with both. By 2021, only 55% of the world's foreign exchange reserves were in US dollars. But with the Russian takeover of financial assets in 2022, the world's de-dollarization efforts reached a whole new level. By the end of 2023, less than 47% of the world's foreign exchange reserves are now held in US dollars. The best quote summarizing the actions of the US government and our politicians comes from economist Peter Sridhar. If the people running our country were deliberately trying to destroy the world economy, they could not have acted otherwise. But friends, this is why we study geopolitics and see what's going on in the world, because there is always something to learn and even find gaps in the investment market. The main reason why Russia was able to avoid all 16,000 sanctions is because it hoarded gold and also pegged its currency to gold. And the reason is simple. It is the only asset that always provides stability in troubling times and at the same time a good investment strategy to use. Friends, thank you. As always, I want to thank you all for your incredible support, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Wishing you prosperity, happiness, and smart investment decisions.